awaken. It's time to awaken to what we are as living souls. You know, as I think about the next part of this, you know, talking about creation, creator, this idea of choice, I want to go back to something I was talking about during the intro. I was talking about my dad's disappearance and what that meant. And I want to go back to that for a minute because this was like the most profound realization I had as a 14-year-old, was this idea that that choice was really that simple, that we could just make a decision and just start doing it differently. And I mean, we hear it all the time, but do we do it? No, we don't. We don't make the choice. Ultimately, we make the choice to not choose, or we make the choice to delay, or whatever. Whatever choices are in front of you, the simple ones, start making those. Don't, you know, a lot of people do this big thing about this big choice they got to make and then they never do. Just start making simple ones that you know you're going to make, and start deliberately choosing how you do it. And that has to start with something. Now, thinking about, and I'm going to talk about sort of how do we come into it, and I'll jump a little bit ahead again. You know, think about when you come into the world, you're that little package, and you have absolutely no control over anything physical, right? Think about it, you're almost still sort of connected to whatever it is you were connected to, right? You're still conscious, is working, your brain, your mind, you have awareness, but what is that awareness then? You don't identify with this form yet. Usually that doesn't happen until 6, 8, 10 months, a year even, before the child looks in the mirror and goes, oh, wow, that's me in there. Before, they don't know that's them in there. Now think about that. When my youngest, Aurora, was born, she became my adopted daughter. She was my granddaughter from my youngest son. And when she was little, I remember holding her in front of the mirror deliberately to see if she would see herself there, and when she became self-aware, when that was. And for her, it was about 3, 4 months is when she started to know, oh, that's me in there. 6 months for sure. She had clear identity. And that was her body that she was watching in there. But only her body she was watching in there, not the whole her, okay? And then as she got older, things that she remembers me showing her. She remembers she was curious about the prism I had in the window, that the sun would come through and throw a rainbow onto the floor, right? I mean, there's a teaching moment. How did that light get to that rainbow? And I could explain it to her. You know, the light enters the prism, and what actually happens is the light slows down, enters at 186,300 miles per second, hits that prism and slows down to somewhere probably 80,000 miles a second, somewhere in this range, quite a bit slower. And what happens is the light bends. And as it bends, you get the colors of the spectrum, because all of those colors are within the white light. Something else I learned in gemology I never knew. Well, you mean white light that you don't see has all the colors? Doesn't that seem strange? But it's how it actually works. This was strange for me too when I was reading it at 14. Was light hits an object like this blue card, hits the object, white light hits it, and all of the colors are absorbed into the material except for the blue, which is reflected back, and we perceive blue light based on the wavelength of that light that comes back. But it's a wavelength, right? What does that mean? It's something that you can't see, but we see color, but not all the others that got absorbed. So again, the way we see reality and the way it is a little different, because again, this filter, what we talked about, you know, sight, sound, touch, taste, these are the perimeters under which we interpret reality physically, right? So those have bandwidth, just like this broadcast. We've been struggling with not enough bandwidth for as many cameras. You can't run them all at once, got to run few. Okay, bandwidth is also perception, and here's how it goes. For the visual system, we can see what we see within the way I described how color is absorbed and things are perceived. But the other thing that's important to note when you think about that is other creatures on the planet can see infrared. They can see at night. They can see heat signatures coming off of people, so they can perceive differently because they have a different bandwidth. In the hearing range, we hear between 150 hertz and 20,000 hertz, more or less. And this is pulses per second, vibrations per second hertz. In terms of audio information with our ears. But a dolphin can go all the way up to 250,000 hertz. It can go like, 12 times more range, bandwidth. An elephant can hear way down to 1 and 2 hertz, very low frequencies. That's interesting. What would you do with that? Well, if you remember that big tidal wave that started in Thailand and killed all those people that Christmas Day all those years ago, and the elephants were running for the high ground, it's because extremely low frequencies of between 1 and 2 and 3 hertz often precede an earthquake, and definitely are there when an earthquake happens, and way before the tidal wave happens. The elephants knew bad news was happening because they heard it, and we couldn't. Pretty interesting. Bandwidth matters. Perception limits what you see. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, right? Right. Bandwidth matters. Now when you start thinking about the individual, bandwidth is limited based on perception, what you believe in. Big part of it. We're going to get into that quite a lot. Knowing yourself is about looking inside and being honest, and that's a difficult thing for a lot of people. We're going to talk about it because what we see within self often we're not too happy with, and that's okay. And I'll tell you why it's okay. There's only 2 people that are going to matter in the end about what's going on with you. You and God. The rest don't count, and this is why. Whatever you're doing against your matrix of values, you're gonna be the most critical critic of all. You're gonna see everything you did wrong, and if you're an honest person, you're gonna deal with that. If you become a sociopath, it's because you didn't deal with that. All right, that you mask it, you hid it, and then you turn into a real winner as far as the rest of the world is concerned, a loser. But you may win, you may beat up a lot of people, you may stomp on a lot of heads on your way to the top, no matter what profession you were in, or in your family, or whatever configuration brings you into a relationship with any human being, because this is what happens. But if you do an honest critical review and you don't beat yourself up to the point of immobility, which you shouldn't, but you just recognize, then just try harder. That's all. Doesn't mean you have to win every time, but you do have to try harder. So knowing oneself is about self-reflection. Every deep thinker, every philosophy, every good philosopher will tell you that. Know thyself as a foundational way to start. Whether you got it from the Buddhists, the Christians, the Muslims, the Jews, or any other occult, anything you ever looked at, any traditional knowledge will tell you, know yourself and be honest with yourself. And that's the beginning of it, really, is the honesty aspect of it. So, building from one's experience is the other way we do it. And I talked about my dad's disappearance and what it did for me. What he couldn't do for me in life, change me. He did for me in death. It took him dying to alter me. Whoa. Is that what I wanted? No. Did it work? Yes. Because it shocked me into recognizing that life is finite and that you have choices on how you spend it. And my dad was a man in a hurry. What he had accomplished by the time he was 40, most people couldn't accomplish in 2 or 3 lifetimes. And he had done it. And anyone who knew him, I don't care where you knew him, will tell you that. And it made me really see that the value of time was what was in short supply. Because my dad wasn't about making a lot of money. It was about making enough so he could do his service, so he could be a public servant. Picking up a tool belt and hammers and learning how to use them was about that. Because after the first building, he went on the next year and built one himself, an 8-plex. And then he built another one, a 12-plex, with some subcontractors and him. And by the time he got to the fourth one, which was another 12-plex, he had subcontractors doing it. He knew what he was doing. And by then he had done the Senate, and by then he was on his way to the U.S. House. And then he did, and then he could. Because once he got to the U.S. House, a lot of people don't know this, you got to have 2 households now. Okay, you got to manage that in D.C., which is not a cheap place to live, or in the suburbs where we lived, and you got to have your residence back in your home state maintained. And we'll talk more about that later. But the individual path and building on one's experience is really what it's all about, what life is all about. A good reflection in and a good look out, and then start looking for the things that exponentially will make you a whole person. And that's going to be the things you love, the things you care about, the things that excite you, and build a livelihood, not a job career to make you the widget maker for the factory owner. Create a vision for yourself that you believe in, that you know you can do. Even if it's an interim vision, it's not your whole life. Who knows that? I can tell you, I thought I knew about a half a dozen times, and it was pleasantly surprised that I was wrong those times. And I'm looking forward to the next 50 years and what it unfolds, because it should be that, an unfolding of more and a learning of more, and growth is, whether you like it or not, going to happen. You can stand still for a while and just get beat up by your own lesson over and over again if you want to, or you can start to move again based on who you are and what lights you up, and then follow a path that you believe in. Now, this is something that I hear a lot because there's a lot of voices knocking on your door, right? Hey, tell you what to do, they'll knock on your door. I want to give one piece of advice on door knocking. The only knocking that matters is when you knock on a door. And this does matter, I believe it. Search and you'll find, knock and doors will be open. I believe that's true. That means for you, simply start your inquiry inside about what you care about and what you believe in, and then follow that until you can line up with a truth that works. I'm going to give you some tools that I definitely will work, but that's it. And the individual path to either love or God, and you can use it either way, but the individual path is your own. And I think about the most critical critics of the path that people follow, right, because they want to tell you how it is and what you ought to be doing. And I'm going to say it, it's Christians telling you you're going to hell if you don't believe like me. And I hear that from a lot of religions, actually. And I sat next to people in Catholic churches, and I sat next to people in Baptist churches, I sat next to people in Assemblies of God churches, and non-affiliated, and a whole bunch of other places I've sat with people. And mostly what I've seen is a lot of people afraid, just deathly afraid of doing something wrong and screwing it up and going to hell. And man, that isn't the way I want my kids to live, and I don't think that's the way a creator wants us to live, and I know that isn't the way love works, okay? So it isn't about that, it's about something different. And what I think it is, and I'm going to say it loudly, is I think it's following your path no matter what it is, no matter what anybody says, as long as you know it's yours and not someone else's, not your sisters, not your brothers, not your mothers, not your fathers, not your kids, yours. And if you're not doing that, then the only one you're cheating is you. And the only thing I'd like to leave you with at the end of all of this today is that you find you again and start doing you again and quit doing everybody else. Because you're worth doing, or you wouldn't have been created to do anything, and you wouldn't be here in the first place. And the illusion is, the delusion is, somehow we're not worth it, and that's not true at all. We're the worst judges of ourselves, but the path we're on needs to be our own. And I'll give you a good example. In the Christian faith, Solomon is known as the wisest man that ever lived, the wisest, the deepest wisdom, the best leader, the wisest. But you look at his history before he was the wisest man. His history was one of studying everything occult, numerology, astrology, conjuring demons even. He did it all. He looked at it all. He had 1,000 wives or concubines, right? I mean, this guy was doing a lot of wild stuff, right? And I think most Christians would say that was very unchristian of him to be conjuring demons and doing all those things. And not that I would agree or disagree with that statement, but I would say it's none of your business, and that's why we have religious freedom in America, is because it was never your business. And King Solomon would tell you that too. And you would listen to him at the end of his trail, even though you want to burn him at the stake in the middle of it. And I don't think men judge men very well in terms of our individual paths. And I don't think it's our job. In fact, if we want to make it our job, most people have. And I buy into this concept, judge ye not lest ye be judged. And what does that really mean? It means go ahead, but you're subject to the judgment you impose on another. That's why when a guy who's really a judge within the court system is one, the ones I've met that I really respect, they get that. They know what they're doing there, and they do it deliberately. There's other judges I've met that don't have a clue what they're doing there. They're there for all the wrong reasons, just like other public servants in other places often are. Too often are, and we'll get into more of that. But the individual needs to recognize our paths are important. We're overly critical because we're taking everybody else's judgments when theirs don't count. Yours does. If you have a good ethical line and you're staying on it, stay on your ethical line. Follow the path that's in front of you with some confidence that it's okay. And when you make mistakes, when you find flaws, when you find untruth, you've got to deal with it. Go back inside, self-evaluate, decide what you're going to do with that new information, then pick a new path. Because no one wants to go into a train wreck. Just when you see it, you might have to unravel a few things if you carried a little too far. Or maybe you drug some people in it with you that now you got to go and deal with that. You got to fix things. So be responsible, be a little bit more deliberate, and listen a lot more to the other guy and respect the fact they're creating the same image you are. But the path we're on is going to be a path of trauma. You think the earth is here to just be entertaining? I don't think so. But it should provide us life. We should have a sense of freedom, of liberty, freedom, that thought that we can just feel that. How many feel that right now? How many can even conceive what that is right now? There's a lot of people I don't think know what that is at all because they don't live free at all. I think about being happy generally. Yeah, everyone has happy moments, for sure. But living a happy life or a way of being where most of it is that way is a pretty rare thing these days. And if you take a close look at that, there's a lot of things I learned about this. Happiness, first Catholic bishop of Brazil I met in lectures in Europe. And he was a very interesting guy when I met him. Catholics tend to be pretty stuffy, in terms of the bishops. They get pretty big on themselves. But he was just wearing regular clothes, and when he identified himself as the first Catholic bishop of Brazil, this is a huge country. And he said, he pulls out of his shirt pocket his white collar and he shoves it back in there and he says, folklore. And I'm like, what do you mean folklore, He said, well, it gets in the way of real conversations with people, and I want to meet people. And man, now that touches my heart. He wanted to meet people, and I learned about him. And he'd been in the front of parades for people where governments wanted to kill him. They threatened him a bunch of times in really brutal ways, scared a lot of people around. It didn't scare him because of the nature of who he was. But I can tell you, there's an honest man, and I asked him, I said in the court's conversation, did you ever have to meet the Pope? And John Paul was the Pope at the time, and he said, yeah, every 5 years I got to go meet the Pope. But he goes, I didn't go last time. Well, why didn't you go last time? And he said, well, my parents were sick. And so I gave the Pope the scriptures he said about taking care of your parents. He said that was his priority, and that's what he was going to do, and that's what he did. And the Pope said, okay, I guess, because he was still the first Catholic bishop of Brazil afterwards. But I had a lot of respect for him in the way he approached his faith, because what he recognized is it was about people and human beings and living souls and how we live and how we work with each other and what we do together. And he'd been among the poor, and I'd been to Brazil at just a year after my dad disappeared. I traveled to Latin America on my own with the Gemological Institute for a month with a bunch of people that were a lot older than me. Most of them were in their 50s and 60s, except for the tour guides. They were in their 30s and 40s. And then it was me, 14 actually, still 14. And what I saw in Brazil, I couldn't believe. I mean, you can see poverty on television, but when you're 14 years old and children not much younger than you want to shine your boots, that's a real humbling thing. And it's an experience I think is unfortunately one we're going to see more now in our own country, as I see what's happening now. We're going to get into a lot of that too as we get through the day, because there's a lot happening now that should not be happening at all anywhere in the world. But I'll say this also about my experience in Brazil, something the first Catholic bishop of Brazil brought to me all those years later that was so true and helped me understand what I was seeing in a different way. Yeah, I saw poverty. I saw a lot of misery within the urban place, Rio, where I remember this most vividly, because all these people had come in from rural areas into an environment that was alien to them, that was not their world. And they ended up in by the millions, literally, in cities made out of cardboard boxes and evolved into whatever over decades. But there was an element of still happiness hidden even within that. When you got into the smaller areas where they hadn't come into the city, you would see it. Poor, for sure, economically, you see all that, but not misery. Big difference. Misery and poverty are big difference, because you can be economically poor and not be miserable. And this is the problem that often we've made in our developmental strategies, including this place, Alaska, and I'll talk more about it later in the day. But when we come into areas really believing strongly, oh, look at this horrible situation we're seeing, everyone is so poor and blah, 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 blah. And then we want to go in and we want to build them houses, and we want to give them cell phones, we want to give them McDonald's, and we're ruining them. We're failing to recognize the humanity that's there and making the assumption by kicking in and knocking on their door that somehow we have something to offer them. We're just the next missionary. Whether you're the environmentalist or the developmentalist, or whether you're the religious person, or whatever you're selling to that culture, wait a minute. Just wait a minute and observe what's there, and recognize that, that should be there, that this is an expression that comes out of the living souls that live there, and that you should respect that, even though you might not understand that, or you need to turn around and get back on whatever brought you there and leave. And see, we didn't do that for the last few thousand years. And everybody's pissed off because of it. Doesn't matter where you go. Drop by the Middle East, drop by Africa, drop by Asia, drop by any state in America. Hey, try to get into Canada to drop by there, they won't even let you in. Or hey, take a trip to Mexico and look at what's going on now on our borders. And my family came through those borders once. And so did most of the people listening to this broadcast, came through somebody's border once. Your relatives for sure did, because no one stood still in this world ever. There's a t-shirt when I went to Chickaloon, when I was working for the Native Americans, that said, it's a big t-shirt, and it was fighting illegal immigration for 500 years, right? I mean, people could feel a lot about that for a lot of different reasons. I could say that about the Romans 2,000 years ago, stomping over my grandfather's and great-grandfather's homeland. But I'm not going there. But when again, how we develop what we look at, how we make judgments about other people, about cultures, we really need to wait a minute and stop a second. And this gets back to, what are we about? Who are we? And what are we? And getting back to the individual. The experiences that we're observing, the things that we're doing, all of us are created the same way. We deserve the same respect. However we're creating our culture, we deserve respect. And that's what's missing. When we take that away, we lose the possibility of relationship with anyone that we try to have relationship with, other than people just like us. And I don't like that. I love my friends. I have so many strange and unusual friends because of all the strange and unusual things I've done. But the core of all my friends is exactly the same in terms of the values. They might be really staunch Republicans and really staunch Democrats and really staunch tribal people and really staunch this and staunch that. Whatever, however they self-identify with aspects of what they experience is fine by me. But the core of them is love, is consideration, is respect, and all the rest is what we do to try and make this thing better, or at least try to figure out our way through it. And so that's what I always call the window dressing of life. It's the things we do, and I don't mean it lightly. It's just that these deeper things are the ones that matter. The values we share in common are the ones that matter. Those are the things that build great countries, great families, great households, where you can be so different and yet united so well. I say, I want to have my funeral before I die. My friend Patricia Wade used to say, my adopted sister, I want to put the fun back in funeral. Now think about that. I mean, whoever went to a fun funeral? I guess there's been some I've been to that are a little crazy. Maybe one of these days I'll tell those stories. But the thought that she had is bringing all of her friends together before she died. And I think it's a great idea, so they can all meet each other, you know, because a lot of people never meet each other until they see each other at the funeral and go, why didn't Joe or Sally introduce us? And we had to meet at their funeral. You know, how many of your friends never met each other? Most of mine. You know, I hope someday I can put the fun in my funeral and have them all in one room, so they'll all look at each other and they'll look at each other and have all of them will have a shocked look on their face and say, how the heck did he know you? Because they're all so different. But the way the core works is the same, and this is what I'm saying. And one of the big things I want to say, as you reflect on yourself and you discover that, and quit being so critical. Now recognize your flaws and work on them. But I'll say it this way. I believe the human soul is the highest creation because we have choices. And if you're going to condemn that creation that much, I would call that blasphemy. That's a strong word. One of my Jewish friends just freaks out, Charles, every time I use that one. Because he goes, blasphemy is such a heavy word. But look, I believe that. You're creating the image and likeness of God, and you're doing that to the point of immobility, to the point of not doing anything, to the point of depression, of collapsing, because of just, don't do that. Would you want your kids to do that? That's Creator's relationship with us, is, hey, let's do this differently. Let's do it like we would want. And if you had a really crummy set of parents, you've at least seen what it might be like. Do your best ideal. Do the best you can, and then seek out knowledge. You know, I mentioned my first marriage. It was 10 years, and it ended. And then I was married again for 26 years. I had about 2 weeks between. All right, in terms of knowing myself, when I gave up Childs, I wasn't kidding. My mom was crying about it. I mentioned that earlier. But then I decided I'm going to be serious about life, so I got married young. I mentioned that earlier. I stayed married for 10 years till I was 26. Got divorced. I was separated two weeks and met my second wife, and was married to her for 26 years. And then was separated from her about 6 weeks, maybe a month, when I met Ann, who eventually was someone I was with for 10 years. When I started dating Ann, the third woman I was with in my life, what I wanted to hear was her story. And what I was listening for was her traumas. I wanted to know, because who I saw in front of me was this happy, wonderful person, but I wanted to know, had she experienced trauma? And then how did she deal with that? And that's what I was listening for. Now I saw the reflection, I saw all that, but that's what I was listening for. And then I discovered all of that and how she overcame her traumas, because everyone has them. If you don't, I really don't want you as my dear friend, because my life, what I think is normal breathing, other people, it's traumatic, you know? I mean, the last guy that stayed at my house for a week, he came walking, he left in a wheelchair, not because anyone hurt him, he just, you know, energetically couldn't quite handle it. But the deal is, what you do with your individual life and how you construct it is going to matter. Your path matters, your experiences matter. Something else I would say this, even if you don't believe in a creator, but you're interested in deciding if there is one, just leave the thought open. That's what I would say. Leave it open, but always ask for grace. Even if you don't believe in it, I would suggest it, because without it, it's going to be a lot harder suffering, because the universe works kind of like this. You put it out there, you want it to happen, the universe says, yeah, good idea. It always brings it the quickest route, which normally involves a 2x4 hitting somewhere around the forehead to get your attention. Because usually you ask for things without really realizing what the unintended consequences might actually reveal. So usually it's trauma for the quick ones. So grace does it a little easier. What it does is say, okay, it doesn't have to be today, it can be tomorrow. So it maybe comes in a little slower, and maybe you can catch the ball and hit it. So grace is important. And guilt, the guilt we live with was a part of what I was trying to say. The self-condemnation piece. You have to find a way to release it, because you're going to screw up. I've screwed up miserably in lots of ways. And people don't think that. You know, people think people like me just, oh, it was all cool, it was just working fine. And so a lot of the story I'm telling also today is revealing. Yeah, I'm like pulling my pants down in front of everyone at a certain level. But there's a reason for that. Is I don't care who it is, because I've met them all. And everyone that's done anything, no matter who you think they are, has suffered greatly, or they wouldn't be successful. And even the ones that seem like they have everything materially, and I've met a few that have everything, billionaires with a B, who are the most miserable people I've ever met. Unhappy, meaning just unhappy. And when you think of liberty and freedom, and if you think money will get you there, it's the biggest trap of all. The lifestyle I live is pretty middle class. I surround myself with a bit of art recently, and a lot of art is gifted to me, and I appreciate art a lot. But when I think of living a moderate lifestyle, why do I choose to do that? Because it gives me freedom. Freedom none of my friends have. They've all created big old hamster wheels. Some of them you can't even see the other end of it, but they're a hamster wheel. And they're stuck on it. They can't even travel. They're imprisoned in the life that they've created. So I didn't want a prison. I wanted liberty as much as I could. And so my life was constructed differently, and at least now it is definitely that way, because I could retire tomorrow and not have to worry about it, not with a lot of money, but with a good living, where I could live and I could do what I love doing. And that's what life is about. I don't care about the big limousines or any of that crap. I don't want any of that. I don't have any of that. I mean, that would be wasteful in my view. But not for the other guy. You know, we each have our own path, is my point. When I think about how it works, you know, in the world they say ignorance is no excuse, right? If you break the law, you hear that all the time. Ignorance is no excuse, and so it makes you feel, oh, even if I screw up, I'm guilty, you know, and that's not true in the universe. Let me say that again. In the universe, not knowing something makes you innocent. Not knowing makes you innocent. Let me give you an example, all right? Whether you believe this example or not, I always use it because it's really a good one, is imagine being Jesus Christ hanging on a cross, and the guy who just slit his side is standing there with the sword dripping in blood. Now, he's the executioner. That's his job, so he just finished his job. And Christ says, God forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. Now, that's a shocking thing. He just forgave the guy that just slit his side open. That's a pretty heavy thing. So all of you Christians that want to emulate the life of Christ, the next time someone insults you, try that one on. That's respect. See, that's what it really is. And that's recognition about when a person's guilty is when they know something, not before. You're not guilty for ignorance. You're guilty for acting with knowledge. And that is willful, and that's called intent. And that's what all of criminal law in the real world is based on. Your intent. That's what they got to prove. That's what God judges too. If you're ignorant, where are you at? You don't know any better, and that's that. So, not knowing if there's a God or not isn't a sin, whether someone wants to tell you it is or not. It's just not. It's a good idea to look, because I think looking for love is always worth it, and unconditional love is the only love worth having. The rest is just not there, not the same. So you can get that. I think you can. Self-love is also okay. People don't think that's okay. If you can't love yourself, you are not going to love anyone else. That's reality. You're not going to have the capacity to do that. So that means a lot of internal work, and that's this section that I'm talking about. You have to do it, because you may be in relationships that you think you love and you're expressing love, but those relationships aren't working because you haven't done that. You haven't reconciled yourself to yourself. You can't do it. You're on a bad foundation. You can do what you've been doing, what everybody's doing, and look around the world. It's not working. It's not working at all. As we look around the world, I don't care whether it's medicine, government, religion, science, art, even art's screwed up. It's not working very well because individuals have given up their God-given rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that is even deeper than that. Those are the effects. And we've lost that, which means we've lost the root that gives us that. The recognition of what we are as living souls occupying these things we call bodies, that I call my carrier, because it's a better expression of it in my way of thinking. It carries me around. This body is subordinated to me, even more so in the last year. It serves me. This body likes to live, so it wants food, and it wants this, and it wants that. That's called the flesh, because it has a function. For most people, that function overtakes them, and so it runs their programming on impulse. Okay, that you see that in the world. You may be part of that in the world. We all are on a certain level, because that's our physical form. It's part of who we are. It should be part of who we are. We're going to talk more about it as we get into it. But we got more to say before we get there. So falling short of your standard, your level of knowledge, or your level of ignorance, however you want to look at it, but falling short is your measure against yourself along your path. And it all had your in it, not me at all. You, your path, your thoughts, your emotions, your evaluation, your choices. Anybody taking that from you is playing God. He won't even take your free choices away from you. What right does anybody else have? That's why judge ye not lest ye be judged is so important to remember in this equation. Don't be in that role of judging all the other people around you. Work on you, be a reflection of something better. Others will see it. They'll go, hey man, what's going on with you? And they'll want to learn from you. What's going on? Not about your brand. They're going to want to learn what works. The rest comes by observation of what works, not this chitter chatter, but what works, what's seen. And truth doesn't excuse. This is a big piece of this. Truth is truth. So when you're following your line of thinking, you run into something that clearly is untrue, you got to go, okay, how do I back out of this? Don't just let pride lock in and go, oh, now I got to defend this bad dissertation. Let it go, realize, hey, laugh a little bit about it. The realization of knowing only takes you to a better place, always. Ignorance doesn't take you anywhere but down. It's a drag, it's not a lift. Enlightenment is knowing something new. It's a lift, even though it may upset your apple cart temporarily. Most of this you laugh about if you live long enough and picked up a few gray hairs. You always do. Hopefully you do. You haven't become too bitter. There's always that as well. One of the things I read early on, and I took this to the village, was Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which again, speaking to the individual. And this says basically there's this idea, and this comes from psychology, sociology, that food, clothing, and shelter are kind of the base things everybody needs. Food, clothing, shelter. Everyone can see that. The next thing up is a sense of safety and security. So this would be like in the modern world, insurance policies in hospitals. You know, in the older world, it might have been a food supply and, you know, in knowing that, you know, there's a lot of things, safety, security, so that bill's a little higher. And then the next one is belongingness, being part of something, like a tribe or a church or political party, fitting in to some larger configuration. And then the last thing, the most important thing, self-actualization. What is that? The highest potential you emerging from you. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When I went and I did this paper for the third world, that I'll get to later, it was about that. It was following that model as you go into a community and you evaluate what's there that you can amplify, but always from this perspective when looking at the individual. And when I went to Chicxulub, that's what it was about. Okay, we have 250 tribal citizens. When I met with the council that first day, it was about what are we going to do? And we used this model for what we were going to do for 250 people. We're going to get them to self-actualization as our government function. Oh, that's a new one, right? That you're going to actually do a government by the people, of the people, and for the people that results in optimized people. What an interesting concept that might be in the 21st century to roll out again. Well, we did. We did roll it out. That'll be a deeper teaching later today, and that'll be a much deeper teaching much later in the course of what we're doing through the Hidden Monks platform. But let's talk Maslow. So we got Maslow. We got him kind of figured out. The spoken word and things spoken into reality. I talked a little bit about that, and the whole idea about being a living soul, our relationship with God as a parent, and the idea of expressing ourselves in the world in a co-creative way. And again, thinking about sort of the metaphors for some of this that are given through every tradition. And I don't mean to make light of any tradition, and I'll use perhaps many in the course of this conversation, because truth needs to be illustrated, and I don't worship at all altars, but I respect all altars. Now there's a big difference there. I respect every man and woman's path to their enlightenment. And I know what mine looked like. It scared the heck out of my first wife, because at that time I was dealing with a lot of the parapsychology science and a lot of the occult stuff. Scared the hell out of her. A lot, okay? I get that. With my second wife, she wasn't worried about that. She wasn't intellectually pursuing anything that I was. It didn't threaten her in any way. But exploration of your life should be done with someone with you if you can do it in union. Otherwise, you'll be doing it alone. But always there's tension when two lives come together, because they're two paths coming together. And they're not necessarily the same unless they merge correctly. And we'll get into that in the next section as we start to move into relationships. But again, thinking about sort of the metaphor again, and I want to go back. I'll use a Christian metaphor. You know, you have this, and it's also Sumerian, also Muslim and Jewish. But you take the beginning story, the Genesis story, and early in that story, God creates man in his likeness, male and female. He created them, and there's a whole line about that, and a couple of lines. So all the souls are created, and then later we get the garden story, and the garden story is kind of interesting. You got Adam and Eve in the garden, and they're naked. That's what we know. They're naked in the garden. They're hanging out with God, and they're creating with God in the garden, whatever that means. Which to me means, wow, you're learning some real things by that teacher. You know, you're hanging out in the garden learning things. But there's The one thing you're not supposed to do is have knowledge of good and evil. Now think about that. That's duality 101, good and evil. But you're not supposed to have knowledge of that in this metaphor that's laid out for us in that beginning story. And that's a very ancient story covering a lot of people in the world today, as a matter of fact. And other cultures have similar stories, which make it even more interesting. But coming out of this situation is God says, you're going to die. You're going to die if you eat this, and you become like God, and you have knowledge of good and evil. And that's kind of the Satan story coming in. Hey, you'll be like God. You'll be like God because you'll know good and evil. And then what happens? They take a bite, but God doesn't kill them. So did God lie? I mean, come on, man. They didn't surely die, or did they? Or did they? They certainly lost what they had. And now what did the first move was? To cover themselves because they knew they were naked, to hide themselves, to hide from themselves, perhaps even in the metaphor. The beginning of denial of relationship and connection to consciousness. The beginning of the that we put, when we think about that part of us, we call it the unconscious. We put an in front of it. We turn it off like a switch when we do that. Because there's nothing about it, except our disconnection from it, which ever since we've fallen from the garden has been the Creator's mission to get us back into creation, with creation again, not in opposition to it. The choice of good and evil brought us into duality, brought us into a world where conflict is the world in every single respect. From digging in the earth to get enough food, to get enough shelter, to get enough clothing. All of those things are now driving us in the directions that we're headed. When I think about innocence and guilt and the free choices and surely dying, and the fact that we did die in a certain sense. But again, as we have a chance to come into the earth, what did we come in as? We came in as stewards, right? This is what we were supposed to do. We're now in the garden of the earth as stewards to take care of this in a way that allows us to thrive within the earth, at least in some fashion. We messed it up. Now we're suffering through the cleanup. And I think we're there. I think we're at a place where people are beginning to turn back into an awareness of what we are as created human beings, and the idea that our choices do matter, and that these ideas of self-image that we've been fed and packed with aren't truly reflected. Kind of the last story for this section, then we'll come back into it, deals with Anne, my former fiance and my dearest friend. Is early in our dating, I was very uncomfortable, and she used to call it my naked hour. So I equate it to leaving the garden and covering up, and it was because as a man I was very uncomfortable, being naked, but it was a metaphor for what makes you uncomfortable. Like I was cleaning up after her son had thrown up one day, and it made her very uncomfortable that I was cleaning that mess up, not her. But that was her naked hour, her moment to let someone do something for her, which she had a lot of difficulty with. But we all have our naked hours when we're exposed, when we're open and vulnerable. And that's not a problem if we're honest with ourselves and we're honest whatever we perceive the Creator to be, and if we do the right things. And we're going to take a short break again, let people kind of adjust and let our team here get a breather. And we'll be right back in just a couple of minutes.